Whilst unknown to many, the Spanish oil poisoning was one of the biggest food-related scandals in history. But because of the age of the incident and poor media coverage, lots of details regarding the poisoning are still vague and unclear. It is the 1st of May 1981 in Spain. An 8-year-old boy by the name of Jaime Vaquero Garcia suddenly fell ill and died on his way to the La Paz Children's Hospital in Madrid. But not only he was affected. Every single one of his siblings showed the same symptoms he had before passing away. This fact worried the medical staff in the hospital. It meant that the new disease might be highly infectious, so the first victims of the soon-to-be epidemic were transferred to the Hospital del Rey, a prestigious clinic for infectious diseases, for further examination. But that was only the beginning. Over 12,000 people were diagnosed within the next 6 weeks. Hospitals were flooded by infected families. 14 provinces were hit by the mysterious outbreak. In the hospitals, only the symptoms could be treated because the illness was still undiagnosed. The whole situation was overwhelming for medical staff and tragic for patients and their relatives. They could only watch as the symptoms worsened, and they did. In the acute phase of the illness, symptoms were fever, vomiting, headache, pulmonary edema, which describes fluid accumulation in the lungs, and severe muscle pain, especially in the legs. Approximately 40% of patients recovered at this stage of the disease, but for those who didn't, it became chronic, causing neuropathy, which is a result of damage done to the nerves outside of the spinal cord and brain, musculoskeletal inflammation, and even limb deformities and Sicker syndrome. A lot of people got disabled by the illness and many of them never recovered. Finally, the epidemic peaked in week 5 to 7 and a steady decline of infections followed over the next 18 months. Final studies concluded that over 20,000 people were at some time afflicted with the disease, and over 2,100 of them eventually died. It was given the name TOS, for Toxic Oil Syndrome. Now, what caused the epidemic? In the first 2 weeks of the poisoning, the actual poison was still unknown. There were suspicions that pets may be the carrier for the disease, and in response to that, a lot of dogs, cats and birds were killed. Others believed that an American airbase leaked a biochemical weapon, but that was soon debunked when the head of a children's hospital asked parents of victims about their children's diet. The result concluded that every child had consumed olive oil before becoming ill. This assumption soon reached national news, and the government announced that olive oil was the cause of the mysterious illness. Oil return stations were built all over the country to prevent anyone from consuming the dangerous substance. You could return your oil that may be suspect and get pure olive oil in return. 2.3 million liters of suspect oil were brought in by consumers. The oil was then analyzed, and it was discovered that there was a lot of cheap rapeseed oil that was adulterated with aniline and sold to the consumers as pure olive oil. Also, the import of industrial rapeseed oil, which is used as a lubricant in the steel industry, quadrupled, even though the steel industry itself was in recession. The aniline in the oil was used as a dye and as an aromatic additive to prevent anyone from using it as cooking oil. It was also discovered that the oil which caused TOS got imported by a company called Rapsa, located in San Sebastian. There, the oil was handled by Raelka and brought to Seville, where another company called ITH tried to remove the aniline from the rapeseed oil by heating the oil to 300 degrees Celsius for 24 hours. The rapeseed oil was then illegally sold as pure olive oil on the streets, but because of the cheap industrial oil that was actually used, it could be sold for 25% less than any other cooking oil. But even though it was vastly believed that the aniline from the industrial rapeseed oil caused the poisoning, aniline itself is not actually poisonous in that amount. The poison only emerged when the company ITH tried to remove the aniline by heating the oil to 300 degrees. At that temperature, the rapeseed oil reacted with the aniline, creating fatty acid esters of 3-N-phenylamino, 1,2-propan-ediol, or PAP for short. These PAP molecules then somehow reacted with the immune systems of the patients. They often showed a decrease in T cells, but an increase in eosinophilia, which is a variant of the white blood cell, and IgE, an antibody for parasites and allergies, which meant that PAP was affecting the immune system, explaining the fever, nausea, muscle cramps, and neuromuscular disease. But this information only really came out after 20 years, published by the World Health Organization. In the meantime, other theories spread. For example, and most importantly, The Guardian released an article which suggests that the main cause of the epidemic may have been organophosphate poisoning. Organophosphates themselves were used as pesticides for the tomatoes that were grown in the far south of Spain, but even though the theory gathered a lot of media attention and support, it was ultimately discarded due to the lack of proof and the clear differences of symptoms between organophosphate poisoning and the adulterated rapeseed oil. The trial started on March 30th of 1987. It was the longest trial in Spanish history and lasted over 15 months, with 3 judges in the courtroom at the same time. Testimony was heard from hundreds of victims and their relatives. The accusations in court were the following. Importers, commodity dealers and retailers have conspired together to sell industrial rapeseed oil adulterated with aniline as cheap olive oil. The product was then sold illegally in plastic jars on weekly fairs and on the street. On March 20th, 1989, 13 out of the 38 defendants were sentenced. The 3 people who received the harshest sentences were oil importer Juan Manuel Bengoechea and the oil distributors Ramon Ferrero and Jorge Pitch. All 3 were convicted of gross professional negligence. Bengoechea was sentenced to 20 years in prison and fined 100,000 pesetas, which equals to 1,250 euros, accounting for inflation. He was acquitted of 600 counts of manslaughter. Ferrero received a 12-year sentence and Pitch was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Many people thought these charges were ridiculously low, considering that the prosecutors were asking for more than 85,000 years of combined prison sentences. Following the relatively mild sentence, there was a massive public unrest, several people fainted, and 1 woman was arrested. In the end, special police forces had to be called in to clear the courtroom. Following the incident and the epidemic it caused, the health minister of Spain was dismissed and new laws to protect the customer were established. The 2.4 million liters of oil that have been returned and exchanged were used in a cement plant as fuel, and the rest was either given to research operations or burned for electrical power. And even though it was a research priority for the WHO, an antidote to the poison was never found. In total, the Spanish government paid over $400 million in healthcare for the victims. The olive oil export of Spain as a whole decreased by 30%, even though olive oil wasn't responsible for the epidemic. But because of the new stringent government policies, the overall quality of olive oil in Spain increased, leading to better tasting oil, and over time, trust to domestic producers was established again. So in the following years, Spain would slowly become the largest olive oil exporter worldwide, producing over 45% of the total olive oil production. And now, 20 years after the incident, domestic Spanish oil is a standard for quality and taste.